21 stone century certainly has its share of disgusting jobs, but in the times before mechanization, indoor plumbing, and electricity, our ancestors really bore the brunt of the literal dirty work. Here are 14 jobs found in history that are not safe while eating. 1. Vomit collector. It's a myth that the ancient Romans had dedicated rooms for regurgitating food, but it was common practice to vomit in order to consume more at the feast. Many individuals would throw up in special receptacles, or simply on the floor to avoid interrupting the bacchanal. Of course, this required the services of a vomit collector who would clean it all up. 2. Leech collector. In the Middle Ages, medicine could barely be described as primitive, and methods such as bleeding were common practice for a multitude of medical ailments. One method of bleeding a patient called for applying leeches, which had to be collected from nearby ponds and bogs. A leech collector would simply wade into the water with bare legs and swish around until the dreaded creatures attached. They were then pulled off and dropped in a bucket to be sold to the town's doctor, barber, surgeon, or other medical professional. 3. Fuller. Wool is a naturally waterproof material, thanks to the oils distributed through it from a sheep's skin. This grease also was what made the harvesting, carding, spinning, and weaving processes run smoothly in the Middle Ages. But the cloth that resulted was coarse, had a wide mesh, and was easily frayed. To solve these problems, the grease had to be removed from the cloth with an alkaline solution. And the cheapest and most abundant alkaline solution at that time was stale urine. A fuller's job was to place freshly woven lengths of wool cloth into a tub, pour in stale urine, and then stomp it with his or her feet. As if that weren't bad enough, the urine used for this process came from multiple people, as many gallons were needed. 4. Groom of the Stool. In the tradition of divine right, which placed kings on the level of gods, for centuries it was thought improper for a king to wipe his own bottom. Henry VIII was no exception, and the Groom of the Stool was a prestigious position assigned to a top-level aristocrat. Though prestigious, the job was humiliating. The groom was responsible for fetching the king's toilet chair when needed, wiping his behind, and collecting his stool for examination and monitoring of his health. He also had the privilege of administering an enema should the king find himself constipated. 5. Violin string maker. Prior to the 17th century's revolution in the technology of string making for musical instruments, the industry was decidedly more disgusting. In order to make strings thick enough to play lower notes on a violin, which at the time had only 3 strings, the preferred method involved twisting strands of sheep innards together. String makers would have to butcher the sheep very carefully so as not to rupture the stomach or lower intestines, and then spend painstaking hours trimming away fatty tissue, blood vessels, and muscle. Then the guts had to be soaked in a solution of wood ash to further clean them, and constantly monitored so that they didn't begin to rot. The innards were then thoroughly dried and twisted into bass strings. 6. Rat catcher. With rapid industrialization in the 19th century, cities became burgeoning hubs of filth and disease. Happily contributing to that were millions of rats. When the problem got out of hand in a certain household, the rat catcher was called in to sort things out. He rubbed oils of aniseed and thyme into his hands and clothing to attract rats, which he would try to catch with his bare hands. Most of these rats weren't killed, they were kept and sold as a tidy source of profit. 7. Match girl. Manufacturing matches themselves wasn't the disgusting part. It consisted merely of dipping short sticks of wood into a phosphorus solution. The grossness happened after you'd been on the job for a few years. Inhaling the phosphorus caused an ailment known as phossy jaw, in which the gums began to abscess and give off a foul-smelling discharge. Eventually, the absorption of the phosphorus caused the women's jaws to take on an eerie glow. The only known treatment was a harrowing operation to remove the jawbone. 8. Bone grubber. Victorian cities had a vast scavenging economy, and the bone grubber fell somewhere in the middle of it. These workers would scavenge rotting bones from butchers' garbage piles and stockyards and sell them to dealers. Some of the bones would eventually be made into toothbrush handles, children's teething rings, and other personal items. What couldn't be sold were boiled down for soap making, and the remainder were ground into fertilizer. 9. Mudlark. At the bottom of the Victorian scavenging economy was the mudlark, a person who walked the riverbanks collecting bits of anything overlooked by other scavengers. These people toiled in extreme poverty, often barefoot, in the freezing water of a city's rivers. There was no telling what they might find. Bits of metal, bone, or cloth could be sold to other scavengers. Dead bodies, human excrement, and rotting fish were occupational hazards. 10. Tanner. Perhaps the most disgusting job of all time, in Robinson's view. Tanners performed the essential work of preserving hides from cattle, pigs, and other animals for use in manufactured goods. The process of preparing the hide was a tedious and foul-smelling one, involving soaking the hides in giant pits of lime to soften the hair and tissues. All of the hair and fat would then be scraped off by hand, a slippery and odorous process. The cleaned hide was then re-immersed in a pit of water and dog feces to further clean and soften it. Of course, these pits were kept fermenting between batches of hides, so the Victorian tannery was one of the most revolting, wretched-smelling places in history. You can find thousands of tanners in the 1,880 U.S. Census. 11. Sewer treasure hunters. In 19th century London, toshers were scavengers who made their living by combing the city's vast network of sewers for lost valuables. Amid the stark contrast between the wealthy and the destitute, many Londoners were so well off they often lost coins, trinkets, and other small items, unknowingly tossing their riches down drains or toilets. For the toshers, the sewer system became a treasure trove of opportunity. These daring individuals, usually led by seasoned elderly guides, would descend into the filthy sewers armed with basic tools like hooks and bags to sift through the muck. They would search for anything of value, including coins, metal, rags, and other discarded items. Despite the noxious environment, toshers could earn a surprisingly good living for the time. Some estimates suggest they could pull in the equivalent of $20,000 per year in today's money. However, this job was not without its risks. Working in the sewers was not only unsanitary but also dangerous due to the threat of sudden floods, toxic gases, and rats. Additionally, toshing was technically illegal, but the potential earnings lured many into this grimy underworld. For some, this work was their best chance of making a living in a city rife with poverty and inequality. 12. Sin Eater. A few jobs had macabre cultural or religious ties. Sin eaters consumed food placed on corpses to symbolically absorb the sins of the deceased, eating in the presence of a body and becoming outcasts due to their association with death. The executioner, on the other hand, played a public and brutal role in capital punishment, facing the grim task of killing criminals through hanging, beheading, or other gruesome methods, and often being shunned by society despite their critical role. 13. Night soil collector. Night soil collectors were responsible for removing human waste from urban areas before the advent of modern sewage systems. They worked primarily during the night to avoid public interaction, hence the term night soil. Their task involved visiting privies, cesspools, and other waste disposal sites, where they would collect the waste in large buckets or carts. This waste was then transported outside the city for disposal, sometimes being used as fertilizer for agricultural purposes. The job was foul-smelling, hazardous, and physically demanding, exposing the collectors to disease, unsanitary conditions, and toxic fumes. Despite the disgust surrounding their work, night soil collectors were essential in preventing urban waste from piling up in city streets. But they were often marginalized and treated with disdain due to the nature of their job. 14. Grave robber. Grave robbers, also known as resurrectionists, had the gory and illegal task of exhuming recently buried bodies, primarily to supply cadavers to medical schools for dissection. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as demand for anatomical research grew, medical schools were in desperate need of corpses for study, but legal supply was limited. Grave robbers would work at night, digging up fresh graves, often targeting the poor or unprotected grave sites. The practice was grisly, as they would remove bodies in various states of decay and deal with the accompanying stench and horror of exhuming the dead. They faced legal risks, as the job was illegal and socially condemned. Many faced harsh punishment if caught. Despite the macabre nature of the work, grave robbing played a significant role in advancing medical knowledge, as it provided necessary subjects for anatomical studies.